Hey guys, tonight we begin with a paradox. We think of air, of oxygen, as the source of life. It fills our lungs, it fuels our blood, it keeps us warm. But there was a time, long before dinosaurs or trees or even the simplest jellyfish, when oxygen was not a gift, it was a poison. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. We have to go back, farther back than we have ever gone before. 2.4 billion years ago. The Earth is unrecognizable. If you stood on the shore of the ancient ocean, you would suffocate in seconds. The air is thick with methane and carbon dioxide. The sky above you is not blue, but a hazy, sickly orange. The sun is fainter, a pale yellow disk struggling through the smog. The ocean itself is green, rich with dissolved iron, heavy and metallic. And it is silent. There is no wind in the trees, because there are no trees. There are no birds. There is no sound of life at all. But the water is alive. It is teeming with single-celled organisms, anaerobic bacteria that thrive in the dark, oxygen-free world. They are the rulers of this planet. They have lived here for eons, perfectly adapted to the gloom. But somewhere in the shallow waters, something changed. A new kind of microscopic life evolved. Cyanobacteria, blue-green algae. They figured out a new trick. They learned how to eat sunlight. They took the pale light of the sun and the water of the ocean and turned it into energy. It was a miracle of biology. But like all industry, it had a waste product. A gas that these little organisms spit out because they had no use for it. Oxygen. At first, it was harmless. The oxygen bubbled up from the algal mats, tiny silver spheres rising through the green water. But slowly, inevitably, the bubbles began to add up. The cyanobacteria were successful, too successful. They spread across the shallow seas, billions upon billions of them pumping out this new, reactive gas. They were unknowingly building a weapon that would destroy their world. The great oxidation event had begun, and the first victim would be the ocean itself.
For millions of years, the ocean acted as a buffer. It absorbed the oxygen like a sponge. But this absorption wasn't peaceful. It was chemical violence. The ancient oceans were filled with dissolved iron. When the new oxygen hit the iron, it reacted instantly. It rusted. Imagine the entire ocean, from the surface to the crushing depths, turning the color of dried blood. The water became heavy with rust. The iron, no longer dissolved, turned into solid particles and rained down to the sea floor. It snowed rust for centuries. Layer upon layer of red dust settled on the bottom of the world, creating the banded iron formations we still dig up today in Australia and Canada. The steel in your car, the girders in your office building, they are made from the rusted remains of that ancient ocean, the scar tissue of the world's first pollution crisis. But eventually, the iron ran out. The sponge was full. The ocean could not hold any more oxygen. And so, the gas began to bubble up to the surface. It broke the tension of the water and entered the atmosphere. The sky began to change. The oxygen attacked the methane haze that had wrapped the Earth in a warm blanket for eons. The orange smog cleared, and for the first time in history, the sky turned a deep, piercing blue. To us, a blue sky is beautiful. To the life living on Earth back then, it was the color of the apocalypse. The oxygen was toxic to the cyanobacteria. It burned their cell walls. It destroyed their chemical bonds. As the air filled with this poison, a mass extinction began on a microscopic scale. Trillions of organisms died, their entire biosphere collapsing because of the fresh air. The survivors were forced to retreat. They hid in the deep mud, in the dark corners where oxygen couldn't reach, where they still hide today. The surface of the world now belonged to the breathers, but the cyanobacteria weren't done. They had cleared the sky, but in doing so, they had made a terrible mistake.
Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas. It traps heat. By destroying the methane layer, the cyanobacteria stripped away Earth's winter coat. The sun, remember, was weaker back then. Without the methane to hold the heat in, the temperature plummeted. It didn't just get cold, the world broke. The ice began at the poles. Massive white sheets expanded, mile by mile, year by year. They crossed the continents, they crossed the oceans. The reflection of the white ice bounced the sunlight back into space, making the world even colder. It was a runaway freeze. The ice met at the equator. The entire planet, from pole to pole, was encased in a shell of ice, kilometers thick. This was the Huronian glaciation, the Snowball Earth. For 300 million years, the Earth was a white, silent tomb. The oceans were sealed under the ice. The land was barren rock, buried in snow. The cyanobacteria, the architects of this disaster, were nearly wiped out themselves, surviving only in tiny pockets of slush near volcanoes or cracks in the ice. It was a silence deeper than anything we can imagine. No waves crashing on the shore, no rain falling, just the wind howling over a sterile white sphere floating in the black of space. Life hung by a thread. It is terrifying to think how close the story came to ending right there. If the volcanoes hadn't eventually pumped enough carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere to melt the ice, the Earth might have stayed frozen forever. But the ice did melt eventually, and when the water flowed again, the world was different. The air was breathable, the sky was blue, and the stage was set for something new to crawl out of the slime. But the ghosts of that first extinction remain. Every time you see rust on an old gate, you are looking at the chemical echo of the great oxidation. And every time you take a breath, remember, you are breathing the waste of a catastrophe that almost killed the world. Let the ice of that ancient world melt away, and let us move forward in time just a little bit. We are now 445 million years in the past. The Ordovician period. The world is a very different place. The sky is blue now, but the land is still empty. If you walked across the continents, you would see nothing but bare rock, red bust, and perhaps a thin coating of green moss clinging to the wet stones. There are no trees to rustle in the wind, no animals scurrying in the dirt. The land is silent and dead. But the ocean is a garden. Life has exploded in the shallow, warm seas. It is a golden age of strange, alien beauty. The water is clear and sun-drenched. The seafloor is covered in vast reefs, not of coral, but of sponges and strange cone-shaped shells. Swimming through this garden are creatures that defy imagination. The trilobites, armoured scavengers scuttling across the sand, their segmented bodies ticking like clockwork. The orthocones, massive, shelled squids, drifting like underwater zeppelins, their long cone-shaped shells trailing behind them as they hunt. It was a paradise, a warm tropical world where life had finally found its footing. The water was stable, the temperature was perfect. It seemed like this summer would last forever. But the earth is restless, and beneath the waves the continents were moving. The massive supercontinent of Gondwana, a landmass containing Africa, South America, and Antarctica, was drifting south. Slowly, inch by inch, year by year, it drifted over the South Pole. And when land sits on the pole, the ice has a place to grow. The cooling began subtly. The warm currents were cut off. The sun seemed to lose its heat. And in the deep south, the first snowflakes began to fall on the barren rock of Gondwana. They didn't melt. They piled up, layer upon layer, crushing the rock beneath them. A glacier began to form, a white, cold heart growing in the south. And as it grew, it began to steal the water from the world.
This is how the world ends. Not with a bang, but with a receding tide. As the glaciers on Gondwana grew miles thick, they locked up the planet's water. They turned the fluid ocean into solid ice. And because of this, the sea level began to fall. It wasn't a sudden wave. It was a slow, agonizing draining. The shallow seas, those warm, sunlit gardens where 85% of all life on Earth lived, began to vanish. Imagine being a creature in that ancient reef. You are used to the warm water, the light filtering down, but day by day, the ceiling of the world gets lower. The water gets shallower, the pressure drops, and then the water is gone. Vast stretches of the continental shelf, millions of square miles of thriving reef were left exposed to the air. The water receded, leaving the sponges and the trilobites gasping in the wind. The garden dried up, the colourful shells bleached white in the harsh sun. Those that could swim retreated, moving deeper into the dark, cold ocean. But there was nowhere to go. The continental shelves plunged steeply into the abyss. There was no new shallow water to replace the old. There was only the deep, dark, crushing cold. And then came the temperature drop. The ice reflected the sun. The world plunged into a deep freeze. The water that remained turned frigid. The tropical animals, adapted to the warmth, simply slowed down and stopped. Their metabolism failed. Their hearts beat slower and slower until they beat no more. The silence of this extinction is a heavy silence. It is the silence of a dried-up seabed. It is the silence of a billion shells lying empty on the sand, waiting for a tide that would not return for 1,000,000 years.
But the Earth wasn't done. The extinction came in two pulses. The first was the ice, the freezing, the draining. The second pulse was the melting.
after 1 million years of ice, the climate shifted again. The glaciers on Gondwana began to melt. The water poured back into the oceans. The sea levels rose again, flooding the dried-out shelves. You might think this was a good thing, a return to normal. But nature is rarely so kind. The water that returned was different. It was stagnant. It was low in oxygen. It brought with it the rotting remains of the life that had died during the freeze. As the water rose, it brought a blanket of suffocation. This is called anoxia. The deep oxygen-poor water rose up and covered the remaining reefs. The survivors of the Ice Age, the few hardy creatures that had managed to cling to life in the deep, were suddenly choked. They drowned in water that had no breath in it. By the time the water settled, 85% of all species on Earth were gone. The orthocones, the rulers of the sea, were decimated. The vast sponge reefs wiped clean. The ocean was empty again. The Golden Age was over. If you were to stand on the shore after this event, you would hear only the wind. The waves would crash against a shore of bones. The water would be grey and lifeless. It is a reminder of how fragile paradise really is. All it took was a shift in the wind, a movement of the land, and the garden was turned into a graveyard. But deep in the mud, tiny things survived. Worms, small shelled creatures, things that could bury themselves and wait. They waited in the dark, listening to the silence, waiting for the world to heal. And it would heal, but it would never be the same again. We move forward again, roughly 70 million years. We find ourselves in the Devonian period. If the previous era was the age of invertebrates, this is the age of fish. The oceans are no longer empty. They are battlegrounds. Massive, armored predators patrol the reefs. The Dunkleosteus, a fish the size of a school bus, with jaws like a hydraulic press, rules the water. It is a time of giants, a time of teeth and scales and power. But the real story of this extinction didn't begin in the water. It began on land. For the first time, the continents are turning green. Life has finally conquered the dry earth. But these weren't just mosses anymore. Something new had arrived, the Archaeopteris, the very first true tree. It grew 60 feet tall. It had fern-like leaves and deep, powerful roots. Forests began to spread across the rocks, creating the first shade the world had ever known. It sounds beautiful, doesn't it? A lush, green world. But nature is a system of balances, and the trees were about to tip the scales disastrously. As these massive roots dug into the earth, they broke up the bedrock. They released vast amounts of minerals, nutrients, and phosphates that had been locked in the stone for eons. When the rains came, these nutrients were washed into the rivers and carried out to the sea. The ocean was essentially fertilizing the ocean, and just like a garden given too much food, the ocean began to choke.
The nutrients hit the water, and the algae exploded. Vast blooms of algae, green and thick, covered the surface of the Devonian seas. They blocked out the sun. The great reefs below, deprived of light, began to die. But the real horror happened when the algae died. As the massive mats of algae sank to the bottom, they began to rot. Bacteria feasted on the decaying matter, and in doing so, they consumed the oxygen in the water. It was a slow, creeping suffocation, the suffocating deep. The oxygen levels plummeted. The deep ocean turned black and stagnant. And then the dead zones began to rise. The black water crept up the continental shelves, invading the homes of the giants. Imagine the Dunkleosteus, the apex predator, the king of the ocean. It has no enemies. Nothing can bite through its armor. But it cannot fight the water itself. It swims through its domain, but the water is thin. It gasps, its gills working frantically to pull oxygen that isn't there. The heavy armor, once its greatest strength, becomes a tomb. It sinks to the bottom, suffocating in the dark. This wasn't a violent end. It was a quiet one. The fish didn't fight each other. They just slowed down. They floated in the gloom, lethargic and tired, until the darkness took them.
This extinction didn't happen in a single day. It was a crisis that lasted for millions of years, a slow, grinding decline. By the time it was over, 75% of all species were gone. The great armored fish vanished, the trilobites severely reduced, but the biggest casualty was the reef itself. The coral reefs of the Devonian were wiped out so completely that for the next 100 million years, Earth simply didn't have reefs. Geologists call it a reef gap, a century of millions of years where the ocean floor was just flat, empty mud. The trees on land had thrived, but in doing so, they had murdered the ocean. If you stood on the shore of that late Devonian world, it would look deceptively peaceful. The new forests would be rustling in the wind behind you, the rivers would be flowing clear. But if you looked out at the sea, the water would look dark, oily, still. There would be no splashing of great fish, no hunting in the shallows, just a vast, silent mirror, hiding a graveyard beneath the waves. It is a haunting thought. The Earth's first forests, the symbol of life, were the cause of one of its greatest deaths. It teaches us that even growth, when unchecked, can become a weapon. And so, the ocean fell silent once more, waiting for the water to clear, waiting for the breath to return to the deep.
We jump forward again to 252 million years ago, the Permian period. The world has changed shape. The continents have drifted together, colliding in slow motion to form a single, massive supercontinent, Pangea. It is a vast, dry land, dominated by reptiles that are the ancestors of mammals. It is a world of deserts, of scrubland, and of relative stability. But deep beneath the crust, in what is now modern-day Siberia, a pressure is building. This is not a normal volcano. It is not a mountain with a hole in the top. This is a flood basalt, a plume of magma from the deep mantle pushing against the skin of the Earth, looking for a way out. And then the crust cracks. It doesn't explode like a bomb. It bleeds. Fissures open up in the ground, miles long. Fountains of lava a mile high roar into the sky. And they don't stop. They erupt for 1 million years. Imagine a wall of fire burning for 1,000 millennia. The lava covers an area the size of the United States. It buries the landscape in basalt rock miles deep. But the lava was the least of the problems. As the magma burned through the earth, it cooked the coal deposits buried underground. It released
trillions of tons of carbon dioxide and methane and sulfur into the atmosphere. The sky turned grey, then yellow. The sun was blotted out by ash. The temperature began to rise and rise until the world was gripped by a fever from which it could not wake up.
The heat was unbearable. The average global temperature rose by 10 degrees Celsius. The poles melted, the oceans warmed to the temperature of a hot bath. And then the chemistry of the world broke down. The massive amounts of carbon dioxide mixed with the rain, creating carbonic acid. It rained acid for centuries. The trees died. The soil was stripped away, washing into the ocean, leaving the continents as barren rock. But the most terrifying change happened in the water. The ocean currents stopped. The water became stagnant. And in that hot, oxygen-starved soup, the ancient bacteria returned. Hydrogen sulfide-producing bacteria, purple microbes that thrive in toxic conditions, bloomed in the trillions. The ocean turned purple. Imagine standing on the shore of Pangea. The heat is blistering. The air smells like rotten eggs, the smell of sulfur. And the waves crashing against the rocks are not blue, but a thick, oily violet. The bacteria released hydrogen sulfide gas into the atmosphere. This gas is lethal. It rose from the purple sea and drifted over the land. It poisoned the plants and the animals. And strangely, it reacted with the ozone layer, destroying it. The protection of the atmosphere vanished. Ultraviolet radiation from the sun poured down, scorching the few survivors. The sky turned a sickly, bruised green. It was a hellscape. A purple ocean, a green sky, and a land filled with the dead. This event is known to science as the Great Dying. It is the only time in history that insects suffered a mass extinction. Even the cockroaches couldn't survive. In the ocean, 96% of all species died. The trilobites, which had survived for nearly 300 million years, were finally extinguished. The reefs, the fish, the mollusks, almost everything was wiped clean. On land, 70% of vertebrate species vanished. The great reptiles, the gorgonopsids, the rulers of the Permian, fell silent. They suffocated in their burrows or starved on the barren plains. Life on Earth was almost reset to zero. The recovery from this event took 10 million years. For 10 million years, the Earth was a wasteland, a quiet, hot, empty rock drifting through space. If you walked the Earth during the recovery, you would see very little. Perhaps a few hardy ferns pushing up through the ash, and one creature, the Lystrosaurus, a pig-sized, burrowing reptile that somehow, against all odds, managed to survive. For a while, nearly every animal on Earth was a Lystrosaurus. It wandered the empty ruins of Pangea, the lonely king of a dead world. The Great Dying teaches us just how close we came to the end. It wasn't an asteroid. It wasn't aliens. It was the Earth itself, breathing out fire and poison and reminding life that it exists only by permission of the planet. We step forward again into the Triassic period, about 232 million years ago. The world has healed somewhat from the Great Dying. Pangea is vast and it is dry. It is a world of red rock, endless deserts and scrublands. The interior of the continent is so far from the ocean
that rain is almost a myth. It is a planet of dust and heat. But then the volcanoes woke up again. This time, in what is now Western Canada, the Wrangellia flood basalts began to erupt. They pumped carbon dioxide into the air, heating the world up just enough to change the water cycle. The ocean warmed. The evaporation increased. Huge, heavy clouds began to form over the ocean, and for the first time they had the strength to travel deep into the heart of the supercontinent. And then the sky turned grey, and the first drop fell. It hit the dust with a soft pock, then another, then another. The smell of petrichor, wet stone, must have been overwhelming, a perfume that hadn't been smelled in the interior for eons. It was a relief at first. The dry riverbeds filled. The cracks in the earth closed up. But the rain didn't stop. It didn't stop for days. It didn't stop for weeks. It rained for 2 million years. This is the Carnian Pluvial episode, a geological blink of an eye where the arid earth turned into a swamp. The red deserts turned into mud. The scrubland turned into a dark, humid jungle. Imagine the sound. A constant, low drumming. Water dripping from every leaf. Streams turning into raging rivers, carving new canyons into the rock. A world wrapped in mist, never fully dry, never fully bright. Just a long, grey, wet twilight.
For the animals adapted to the desert, this was a nightmare. The dominant predators of the time, the large, lumbering reptile relatives known as rausuchians, and the remaining dicynodonts, were built for dry land. They were built for hard ground. Now, the ground was a bog. The vegetation changed completely. The hardy desert plants rotted away. In their place, tall conifers and vast fields of ferns exploded out of the mud. The food source changed overnight. The herbivores couldn't digest the new, tough leaves. They began to starve. And the predators, sinking in the mud, struggled to hunt. Their world was dissolving beneath their feet. It was a slow, wet extinction. There was no fire, no ash, just the relentless dampness, the rot, the fungus growing on the skin of the old kings. The ecosystem was being washed away. The specialized creatures of the dry Triassic were simply incompatible with the new wet world. They faded away, leaving their bones to be buried in the rapidly accumulating river sediments, which we dig up today as layers of grey siltstone sandwiched between the red desert rocks. But while the old world was drowning, something new was waiting in the undergrowth. Small, agile, bipedal creatures. They were fast, they were adaptable, and they seemed to love the new, lush vegetation. They were the dinosaurs. Before the rain, dinosaurs were a minor group. They were small, rare, and insignificant. They lived in the shadow of the giant crocodiles and the mammal-like reptiles. But the Carnian Pluvial episode was their golden ticket. The explosion of plant life gave them endless food. The extinction of the old predators gave them endless space. In the 2 million years of rain, the dinosaurs diversified. They grew bigger. They took over every niche left empty by the rain. By the time the clouds finally broke, and the sun dried out the land again, the world had changed forever. The age of the mammal ancestors was over. The age of dinosaurs had begun. It is strange to think that the mightiest creatures to ever walk the earth owe their reign to a rainy day that just wouldn't end. The rain washed away the past, and when the mud dried, the giants were ready to inherit the earth.
We move forward another 30 million years, to the end of the Triassic. The world is dominated by a single massive shape, Pangea, the supercontinent. It stretches from pole to pole, a vast unbroken island of stone floating in a single global ocean. It seems eternal, it seems solid, but nothing in geology is forever. Deep beneath the feet of the first dinosaurs, the mantle is churning. Heat is building up under the thick crust of the supercontinent. It is like a pot boiling with the lid left on tight. The pressure has nowhere to go. And so, the land begins to tear. It starts with a low, vibrating hum, a sound too deep to hear, but strong enough to be felt in the bones. The ground begins to buckle. Great cracks open up in the earth, running for thousands of miles. This is the Great Rifting. Pangea, the mother of continents, is breaking its heart. It is ripping apart, right down the middle. North America is pulling away from Africa. Europe is pulling away from the Americas. The ground drops, forming a massive valley, a wound in the crust. And into this wound, the fire pours. This wasn't just a volcano. This was the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, a tear in the skin of the world stretching for 6,000 miles. Magma didn't just erupt, it flooded. It filled the rift valleys with liquid rock. It burned the forests. It boiled the lakes. And as the continents drifted apart, the gap between them filled with fire before it would eventually fill with water.
The birth of an ocean is a violent thing. As the Atlantic Ocean was born, it was baptized in smoke. The eruptions released massive amounts of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide. The sky, once again, darkened. The temperature, which had been warm, spiked. The world became a hothouse, but it was a toxic hothouse. The sulfur mixed with the moisture in the air, and the acid rains returned. But the real devastation happened in the water. The ocean absorbed the excess carbon. It became acidic. The delicate balance of the sea was broken. The creatures that built shells, the corals, the ammonites, found that their homes were dissolving. Their shells, made of calcium carbonate, could not form in the acid water. They were soft, vulnerable, and dying. The reefs collapsed again. The ancient, shelled relatives of the squid vanished by the billions. The ocean floor was littered not with shells, but with the dust of dissolved calcium. And on land, the competitors of the dinosaurs were facing their end. The large crocodile-like predators that had ruled the Triassic alongside the dinosaurs could not adapt to the rapid swings in climate. The heat, the acid, the changing landscapes, it was too much. They faded away. The large amphibians, the size of cars that lurked in the swamps, dried up and died. The world was being cleared. When the smoke cleared and the eruptions finally slowed down, the world looked different.
Pangea was gone. In its place were two massive land masses, drifting away from each other, separated by a narrow new seaway, the baby Atlantic Ocean. It was a lonely sight. The continents, which had been united for so long, were now strangers, waving goodbye across a widening blue gap. But on the land, there was a silence and a vacancy. The monsters of the Triassic were dead. The competition was gone. And standing in the ashes, unharmed and adaptable, were the dinosaurs. They had survived the heat, they had survived the acid, and now they looked out at a world that was empty, lush, and waiting for them. This extinction was the final gate. It locked the door on the ancient past and opened the door to the Jurassic Park we all know. The giants could now grow without fear. The long-necked sauropods, the fierce theropods, they had the planet to themselves. The breaking of the world was the making of the dinosaurs. But as you look at a map of the world today, at the way Africa and South America fit together like puzzle pieces, remember the violence of that separation. Remember the fire that burned between them and the silence that followed as they slowly drifted apart.
We jump forward now to the most famous day in the history of the world. 66 million years ago, the end of the Cretaceous. The world is lush, it is warm, it is loud. The continents are drifting closer to the shapes we know today. Great forests of conifer and palm cover the land, and walking among them are the masters of the earth. The Tyrannosaurus rex, hunting in the shadows. The Triceratops, grazing in the meadows. Pterosaurs the size of aeroplanes, gliding on the thermals above. They are the climax of life on Earth. They are big, specialized, and seemingly invincible. But high above them, in the cold silence of space, a rock is tumbling. It is roughly 10 kilometers wide, the size of Mount Everest. It has been traveling for eons, a lonely wanderer in the dark. But its journey is about to end. It enters the atmosphere over what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. It is moving so fast that the air in front of it cannot get out of the way. It compresses and ignites. A second sun appears in the sky. For the dinosaurs looking up, there was no sound, just a blinding, silent flash of light, brighter than anything they had ever seen. And then, in an instant, the world changed. The impact was absolute. The asteroid slammed into the shallow sea with the force of 10 billion atomic bombs. It punched a hole in the crust of the Earth, 20 miles deep. The ground liquefied. A ring of mountains, higher than the Himalayas, rose up and collapsed in minutes. A shock wave tore across the Americas, flattening forests, snapping trees like matchsticks, and vaporizing everything in its path. But the explosion, as terrible as it was not what killed the world. The explosion was just the doorbell. The real killer was the dust.
When the asteroid hit, it threw billions of tons of rock and water and dust into the upper atmosphere. The debris was launched into space, and then gravity took hold. It began to fall back down. Imagine a night sky filled not with stars, but with falling fire. Trillions of tiny meteors re-entering the atmosphere all at once. The friction heated the air.
The sky turned into a broiler. For a few hours, the surface temperature of the Earth spiked. The forests caught fire, spontaneously. Across the globe, the world was burning. The animals that couldn't burrow, the animals that couldn't hide under the water, were cooked alive. And then the fire went out, and the cold set in. The smoke from the fires and the dust from the impact formed a thick, choking blanket around the planet. It blocked out the sun. The day turned to twilight. Then the twilight turned to night, and the night didn't end. For months, perhaps years, sunlight could not reach the surface. Photosynthesis, the engine of life, stopped. The plants died. The herbivores, staring into the gloom, starved. And the predators, having nothing to hunt, followed them into the dark. It was the impact winter, a deep grey freeze. The tropical world of the Cretaceous was replaced by a landscape of ash and ice. The mighty T-Rex, the king of the world, shivered in the dark and closed its eyes for the last time. 75% of all life died. The non-avian dinosaurs vanished completely. The pterosaurs, gone. The great marine reptiles, gone. The silence that followed this extinction is the silence of a library after closing time. The giants were gone. The roaring was over. But in the quiet, in the ash, something was moving. Small, furry creatures. Mammals. Our ancestors. They had survived because they were small. They didn't need much food. They could eat insects or roots or the dead. And most importantly, they lived underground. They had hidden in their burrows while the sky fell. And when they finally poked their noses out into the cold, grey world, they found it empty. The ferns were the first to come back. We see it in the fossil record, the fern spike, a layer of rock where the only pollen found is fern spores. They colonized the ash, a green carpet growing over the bones of the gods. And with the giants gone, the mammals were free. They crawled out of the holes and began to inherit the earth. The KPG extinction is a tragic story, but it is also our story. Without that rock, without that dust, without that terrible winter, the dinosaurs would still be here, and we would not. We are the children of the asteroid. We are the survivors of the day the sky fell.
Let the dust of the asteroid settle, and let us move forward again. We are now 34 million years in the past, the Eocene epoch. The world has recovered from the dinosaur extinction. In fact, it has flourished. It is a greenhouse Earth. The planet is lush, green, and incredibly warm. If you were to travel to Antarctica in the Eocene, you wouldn't need a parka. You would need a sun hat. The South Pole, which we know as a frozen wasteland, was covered in a temperate rainforest. Palm trees, ferns, and beech trees grew on the shores of Antarctica. Early mammals, strange, lanky ancestors of marsupials, scuttled through the warm leaf litter. There was no ice. The world was a garden, stretching from the equator to the ends of the earth. It was a time of dense, dark jungles. The canopy was so thick that in many places the ground never saw the sun.
It was a humid, dripping world, echoing with the calls of strange, archaic beasts. But the continents were still moving. They are always moving. South America, which had been holding hands with Antarctica, finally pulled away. Australia dragged itself north, and for the first time, Antarctica was left alone, isolated at the bottom of the world. And as the gap between the continents opened, the ocean rushed in.
This new gap is called the Drake Passage, and its opening changed the destiny of the planet. Before this, warm water from the equator flowed south, keeping Antarctica warm. But when the passage opened, a new current was born, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. A massive river of water circling the continent endlessly. It acted like a wall. It blocked the warm water from the north. It trapped Antarctica in a prison of cold water. And so the temperature dropped. It wasn't a slow decline. Geologically speaking, it was a cliff. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere plummeted. The eternal summer of the Eocene broke. On the high peaks of Antarctica, the first snows fell. And this time, they didn't melt. They compacted. They turned to ice. The glaciers began to march down the mountains, crushing the ancient forests. The palm trees shriveled in the frost. The ferns turned black. The lush, green paradise was buried under a mile of white silence. The ice sheet we see today was born. But the cold didn't stay in the south. The cooling of the ocean cooled the world. The global temperature crashed. The tropical belt which had covered the planet shattered.
This event is known in Europe as La Grande Coupure, the Great Break. As the world cooled, the air became drier. The moisture was locked up in the ice. The great rainforests that had covered Europe and North America began to die. They couldn't survive the cold, dry air. The trees retreated, and in their place, something new appeared. Something we take for granted today, but back then was a barren landscape. Grass. Open, wind-swept plains spread across the world. For the animals adapted to the dark, safe jungle, this was the apocalypse. There was nowhere to hide. The archaic mammals, the strange, tree-dwelling creatures of the Eocene, vanished. They were replaced by new animals, runners, grazers, animals built for the open cold. The ancestors of horses, rhinos, and deer. The sound of the world changed. The dripping humidity, the insect buzz of the jungle was replaced by the sound of the wind, whistling through dry grass. The silence of the plains. If you stood in Europe during the Great Cooling, you would feel the first true winter the world had seen in eons. You would see the breath fog in front of your face. You would see the frost on the ground. It was the end of the greenhouse, the end of the tropical dream. The earth had put on its winter coat, and it has never really taken it off since. The ghosts of that time are under the ice. Somewhere, deep beneath the Antarctic glaciers, are the frozen stumps of palm trees, waiting in the dark, remembering the time when the ice was green.
We jump forward to the very edge of human memory. 12,800 years ago, the end of the Pleistocene. The Great Ice Age, which had gripped the world for 100,000 years, was ending. The glaciers were retreating.
The sun felt warm on the skin. The tundra was blooming into wildflowers. It felt like spring. Early humans, our direct ancestors, were spreading out across the world. They were lighting campfires in new valleys, hunting the great herds in the growing forests. The world seemed to be waking up. But then, in the span of a single human lifetime, the door slammed shut. The warming stopped, dead in its tracks, and the world plunged back into the deep freeze. It happened incredibly fast. Some studies say the temperature dropped by 10 degrees Celsius in just a decade. Imagine that. 1 year, you are hunting in a meadow. 10 years later, that meadow is buried under permafrost, and the glaciers are marching back down the valley, crushing the trees you grew up with. This is the younger Dryas. It is named after a flower, the Dryas octopetala, a small, hardy, white flower that loves the cold. As the world froze, this little flower spread across Europe. It bloomed over the graves of the forests. It was a white flag signaling that winter had returned, and it wasn't going to leave. What caused the world to snap back into the freezer? The leading theory is water. As the great ice sheets over North America melted during the warming, they formed a massive lake, Lake Agassiz. It was larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined, an inland ocean of cold, fresh meltwater, held back by a dam of ice. And then the dam broke. An unimaginable volume of fresh water rushed into the Atlantic Ocean. It wasn't just a flood, it was a chemical weapon against the climate. The ocean currents, the conveyor belt that moves warm water from the equator to the north, depends on salt. Salt water is heavy, it sinks. This sinking action pulls the warm water north, keeping Europe and North America temperate. But fresh water is light. It floats. When Lake Agassiz emptied into the sea, it formed a lid of fresh water over the Atlantic. The heavy, salty water couldn't sink. The conveyor belt jammed. The warm water stopped flowing north. The heat was turned off instantly. Europe froze. The wind howling off the Atlantic wasn't bringing rain anymore, it was bringing ice. The deserts grew. The forests died back into scrubland. The world, which had been so close to recovery, was thrown back into the dark.
This was the final curtain for the megafauna. The woolly mammoths, the saber-toothed cats, the giant ground sloths, they had survived the Ice Age. They were tough, but they were adapted to a specific world, the mammoth steppe. The younger Dryas, chaos, the rapid warming, then the rapid freezing, destroyed their food sources. The grass changed, the nutritious plants they needed vanished. It wasn't a meteor that killed them. It was the landscape shifting beneath their feet too fast for them to keep up. Imagine the last great herds. They are walking into a blizzard that never ends. They are hungry. Their breath mists in the air. One by one, they fall behind. The silence of the younger Dryas is the silence of emptiness. When the ice finally retreated again 1,000 years later, the giants were gone. The world that emerged was our world, the Holocene, a world of seasons, a world of agriculture. But it is a lonely world. We walk through forests that feel empty because they are empty. The creatures that should be here, pruning the trees, thundering across the plains, are missing. The younger Dryas was the last time the earth blinked. It reminds us that the climate is not a dial that turns slowly. It is a switch, and sometimes, without warning, the switch flips.
And so we arrive at the end of the timeline, the present day, the Holocene. For the last 11,000 years, the Earth has been unusually kind. The climate has been stable. The seasons have been predictable. It is the long summer of human history. It is the era of cities, of agriculture, of writing, and of us. But if you listen closely to the background hum of this era, you will hear a familiar sound, or rather, the lack of one. The silence is returning. This extinction is different from the others. There is no fire raining from the sky. There is no ocean turning to acid. There is no ice sheet crushing the continents. This extinction is a ghost story. It happens in the quiet corners. It happens when we are not looking. It is the story of the empty forest. You walk into a wood today and it looks green. It looks healthy. The trees are tall. The moss is soft. But the air is still. The symphony of bird calls that would have deafened a traveller 2 centuries ago has faded to a whisper. The animals are vanishing, not with a bang, but with a sigh. They are retreating into the shadows, and then slipping off the edge of the world. We call it the Holocene extinction, but it feels less like a catastrophe and more like a forgetting. We forget what used to be here, and so we don't miss it when it's gone.
Consider the passenger pigeon. In the 19th century, huge flocks of them would darken the sky over North America. There were billions. When they flew overhead, it sounded like a storm. They were as common as the rain. And then, within a single human lifetime, they were gone. The last one, a female named Martha, died alone in a cage in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914. When she took her last breath, a lineage that had survived the ice ages, survived the storms, simply stopped. She was stuffed and put in a museum, a creature of the sky turned into an object of dust and glass eyes. Or think of the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger, a ghost of the southern forests. It was hunted, pushed to the edge, until the last one, named Benjamin, paced around a concrete pen, exposed to the cold, until he locked the gate on his own species forever. These aren't ancient monsters like the T-Rex. These were our neighbours. They were here, just a moment ago. The tragedy of this time is that we have the power to name the things we are losing, but not the power to bring them back. We are building a library of the dead. Museums filled with shells and skins and bones of things that will never breathe again. It is a quiet, accumulating loss, like a library burning down, one book at a time.
But if history teaches us anything, it is that the Earth is patient. We have looked back tonight across billions of years. We have seen the sky turn orange and blue and black. We have seen the oceans freeze and boil and turn to acid. We have seen 96% of life wiped out in a heartbeat. And yet, every single time, life returned. It crawled out of the mud. It swam out of the deep. It sprouted from the ash. The Earth does not end, it changes. The silence we hear now is not the end of the story. It is just the pause between chapters. The dinosaurs are gone, but the birds are singing. The mammoths are gone,
but the elephants are walking. The world heals. It takes time, millions of years, time that we cannot comprehend, but it heals. So, as you close your eyes tonight, do not fear the silence. The earth has survived fire and ice and poison. It is older than us, it is stronger than us, and it will be here spinning in the dark long after we are gone. The story continues. The wheel turns, and the life finds a way. Sleep well.